Hello and welcome to another That's Just Wild Q&A, where we answer your burning questions about nature and wildlife. I'm Steve Backshaw, and as always, I'm joined by...
Me, Lizzie Daly.
And me, Sarah Roberts.
We are still here in Cheltenham for the wonderful Cheltenham Science Festival, which is very exciting. First question is for you, Steve, for today from Nicola on email. She said, if whales evolved from land animals, there must have been a really weird in-between animal, or would that transformation from land dweller to sea dweller have happened quite quickly?
The whole idea of missing links, that there has to have been one peculiar in-between species, it is very much discredited now. There is always a gradual line of evolution from a common ancestor to the animal that we have today. And those changes, they can happen relatively quickly, but relatively quickly is still tens or hundreds of thousands of years. Anyone who'd like to learn more about this, I'd encourage them to read The Ancestor's Tale by Richard Dawkins, which really gets into the evolutionary history of particular animals that we have around today. And I have to say that I think the evolution of the whale is the most interesting.
Yeah.
So where it comes from, I mean, you can go way, way back, hundreds of millions of years, and it would have been from a sea-based animal, would have been its common ancestor, which then came onto land. And then about 50 million years ago, we're aware of things like Pachycetus, which kind of looked like... Have you seen The Princess Bride?
No.
Have you seen The Princess Bride?
No.
Well, what you see, you'd see.
What
honestly,
year is this?
1692.
Do we have a more
This
recent...
is the greatest children's film of all time, and neither of you have
Sorry.
seen it.
Is
Okay,
this
so
your child?
anyone out there who has got an inkling of cultural history, the rodents of unusual size in The Princess Bride is what Pachycetus looked like. This kind of long, stretched out, very rodent-like animal with almost trotters on the end of its legs. And the idea is that they would probably have hung out in around estuaries, marshy, swampy habitats, and would have gone in and out of the water to feed, but lived a lot of their lives on land.
Quite amphibious then.
Like a giant capybara?
Sort of,
Isn't it
yeah.
a
Actually, no,
crocodile
yeah, not too
farm?
far away from that. Not too far away from that. But mammalian and hairy, and, you know, nostrils towards the front of the head, so they hadn't yet migrated back to the top of the head to become a blowhole. So then the next in the fossil record that we have is Ambulocetus, or the walking whale, and that appeared to have a much more marine lifestyle. So it seemed to have webbed limbs, much less ability to hold itself up, what we call a graviportal physiology. Didn't have that, looked like it spent most of its life in the water. Then as you bounce on over the next 50 million years, you see animals that are progressively losing, particularly the rear limbs. They have the nostrils migrating down the head until they end up being a blowhole on top of the head. And this happens gradually. It happens gradually over time. You know, we have lots and lots of gaps in our understanding. It's not because they weren't there, it's just because the fossil record is so incomplete. And you can still see today, if you go and you find inside a museum a skeleton of, for example, a northern right whale, and you head towards the back end of the skeleton, you will see a couple of vestigial bones that are the remnants of the pelvic girdle and of the rear limbs that it used to walk on land with. They are still there today, and they're one of those real key things that you look at in evolutionary biology as, you know, evidence that these things have changed vastly over time.
Yeah. I think when you hear that question, it's a good one, right? Because I think we try to understand it on a level where it's literally like in the water, on land. But of course, this is evolution that happens over millions and millions of years, and all these incremental changes lead to what we see today. But it's kind of hard to imagine what an animal that was marine now on land.
If you try and imagine Ambulocetus, so that's the second one in the line, if you try and imagine what a mammalian crocodile would look like, it's very much like that. So kind of a slightly hairy, obviously mammalian crocodile. That's what it looked like. And, you know, these changes take an awful lot of time. One of the really intriguing things about this is when the ability to echolocate and to use the complex sounds that whales and dolphins do today originated. And one of the intriguing things about that is that a common ancestor way back before even Pachycetus led on another branch towards our modern hippos today.
What?
And modern hippos, so yeah, way back in evolutionary history, hippos and whales had a common ancestor. And if you listen to hippos underwater now, they have sounds that are very, very whale-like, very cetacean-like. It's not like the wheeze honk of a hippo above the water. So it seems like those things could have been way, way back, 50 million years ago. They started using clicks and squeaks and other methods of communicating with each other, but also of bouncing back sound off their environment to get a sense of where they were.
Love it. That's
Right.
great explanation as well. Also, just good to kind of actually picture those. I would highly recommend looking at pictures of some of these incredible animals because they're so funky looking, aren't they?
They are.
They're brilliant.
Yeah. So now, next up for you, Sarah, from Jamie. Why do rats have a reputation for spreading disease? Surely they don't carry more germs than any other animal. Or do they?
So they have a reputation, don't they, as man's worst friend. And I just want to say, I had 2 rats, Pinky and the Brain, and I thought they were quite great, to be honest.
They're so intelligent, rats. How long did you have them for?
They were probably about 7 or 8 when they died. Yeah. But they did smell. And I think that's part of the problem. So we do associate rats with diseases, particularly like leptospirosis, hantavirus, but more interestingly, the plague. You guys must have heard at some point in school that rats carried the plague.
And that was incorrect, wasn't it?
It's incorrect,
Yeah.
yes. So there was newer research which revealed, because we used to say it was the fleas on rats, but actually it's the fleas on people and the human lice that were transferring the Black Plague. So they did get a hard rep for that. And then also there's that other saying that we always say, you know, you're never further than 6 foot away from a rat. Not true.
Well, I'm guessing that right now we're probably more than 6 foot away from a rat.
Well, and that's
Is that not from the London Underground? I think you might be...
maybe like
Might be
certain,
misquoted.
maybe certain spots, but
In
it's
your
used,
bed, you are.
It's used generally everywhere throughout the cities. But it's actually, scientists have worked it out, and it's actually you're never further than around 164 feet away from a rat. So, you know, they're there, but not quite as we imagine it.
That's definitely not as full-on a statistic. With the earlier thing, are you saying that Horrible History's got it wrong?
Yeah.
Because it starts with a little flea.
It wasn't. Well, it wasn't. It was a flea. They just need to edit out or make the rat like a really kind of not so nice person, maybe, and then they can spread it around that way. But yeah, generally it came from humans, as far as we know. We spread it ourselves. Terrible.
I've never had rats myself, but I
Yep.
just find them fascinating. And one of my favourite things about rats is how they're used to actually sniff out landmines. Aren't they? There's like a whole team that's dedicated to that.
Yes. So rats, as I said, get really bad credit, but a popo, I think, is the one you're talking about.
Pounced rats.
Yes. So well, for a start, anyone that's not seen those type of rats, they're so cute. They're massive. I would have traded Pinky and the Brain just for one of those. Don't R.I.P. But they're massive, and they're like little, kind of almost like dog size, with a little bell that they can alert and signal if they find a landmine. But they've trained them for all sorts of things, from finding different diseases in people's blood to also more recently trafficked pangolin scales. They're going around the shipping areas smelling out lots of different things. So they're really useful species. I do think they had a bad rep.
Can I be a bit controversial?
Go on.
Yeah. Is there a possibility that they've been used to detect landmines, because if they get it wrong, then we probably don't care so much?
100%. No, we use them.
If it was a sniffing dog, if it was a
dead.
beagle and it was like,
I mean,
there'd be complaints.
we
Whereas
still
if it's,
use that.
And it was
everyone's like, oh, it's just a rat.
No, they have whole retirement parties for them and everything. There was one recently that got retired.
They get named. They get
feel
human
good
names.
study. They do it. I think that one was
like one for Tina or something.
Yeah,
or something.
Who would give human names to a rat?
Yeah, Pinky and the Brain. I did all right. I did all right with that one. I thought they were classic names. But anyway,
misrepresented.
misrepresented. The research was skewed.
Steve, you're not a fan of rats?
No, I find rats absolutely fascinating. And it's a massive group. You know, the biggest section of the mammal group are rodents. And there are so many different kinds. And there are different rats for there's so many different environments and habitats, and many of them are utterly fascinating. Even the invasive rats that we have here, their intelligence, their problem-solving ability, their adaptability, their swimming, their climbing, their ability to exist alongside us, it is, from a biological perspective, absolutely fascinating. I did, however, when I built my new house and I knocked down the old one, I did it at a time when I had just got my first ever new car. And the next day I went down to my new car and I went to start it and it wouldn't start. It was completely flat, no battery, everything had gone because they'd gone inside my brand new car and they'd eaten out basically everything in the engine that had any fluid on it whatsoever. Completely destroyed it. I had the car for about 3 days and it cost me about £2,000 to get it redone. So yeah, that side of things.
Yeah, they do cost a bit of money, don't they, to be fair. But the thing is, the end of the day, rats do get a bad rep, but the urban rats especially, and urban pigeons and urban everything else, just because they're studied 100 times more than anything else. So when you take that out, which scientists have done, they actually don't carry any more diseases than any other mammal in the UK.
It's that proximity, isn't it, to us and in cities, and that association with being a pest and taking over. But I think they're awesome.
And it is still such a great offensive word to be like, you're such a rat, you dirty rat. So next question for you, Lizzie, is from Nick in Brighton, who wants to know, if humans hadn't evolved, is there any non-primate that could get as smart as us one day?
That's such a good question. Such a good question.
It's kind of scary.
It's kind of scary, yeah. So we know, of course, there is intelligence across the natural world. And I'd pick out 3 main groups that I think would be up there as contenders in terms of intelligence. A world without humans, in terms of what that looks like in being smart and how that evolved, would be different, right? You're not going to get octopus with iPhones and corvids building...
Really? Why not?
Scrapers.
Why not?
Well, let's get into it. So I would say that the cetaceans group, so dolphins and whales, in terms of their cognitive abilities and filling that kind of niche, they'd be up there with, you know, how they continue to evolve in both their language and culture. We know they are excellent problem solvers. They have these complex social structures. They are up there with some of the most smart, right? Then we've got our corvids, so our ravens, our crows, our jays in the back garden, to the kind of giant ravens that you get up in Alaska. Incredibly intelligent, able to do complex puzzles and step-by-step challenges. They have that cognitive ability, but they don't have the size, they don't have the strength, and of course they don't have the ability to manipulate.
Wouldn't they change though, over if given enough time? Could they get really big and, you know, become a bit more manipulative with the feet?
So this is where it's quite a complex question, isn't it? But just in terms of intelligence, I would pick them as probably one of the contenders for being able to push themselves cognitively. But obviously there's basic physiological and physical adaptations that would limit them, right? And that's where they'd probably shape a world in a different way to how we do. We're able to manipulate things, change the world around us, use those tools to build other things. If you go to, say, then the cephalopods, the octopus, the squid, there's elements of, with some octopus being able to use tools, as we know, picking up shells and using them for the environment around them. But they're short-lived. They may live a year, 2 years. They don't have the social structure that we do. So I think within each group, a very intelligent animal, yes, they could potentially, I think, fill a cognitive niche, but there'll be other limitations as to how they can then change the world around them to actually have that kind of smart like we do. Or maybe they'll create a world that is smart and is intelligent, but it's just completely different to ours. Maybe they'll have incredible hunting techniques or kind of social structures that we haven't even...
Maybe it's already happening. You know, instead of Planet of the Apes, it could be Planet of the Octopus. We just haven't seen it because it's just deep down there.
The problem is, we're here. We're ruining everything, right? So
I think if you don't come at it from the anthropocentric angle, I think that it probably would be most likely to happen in a so-called hive mind. So more likely to evolve in what we would consider to be simple organisms, but have the opportunity to work together as a massive force. So, you know, for example, Hymenoptera that can communicate using chemicals. Ants, bees and wasps.
Oh, okay.
That can, for example, create complex structures that can do incredibly complicated strategies. But they each individually have a brain the size of a full stop. And when you put them all together, operating on simple chemical cues, they can do incredibly complicated things. In some ways, it's not too dissimilar from artificial intelligence.
But in terms of, just very quickly to touch on that, individually, I guess they have, as you say, the brain the size of a pea. So would you class that as like filling a cognitive niche, or is it like, I guess, that group mentality that you would class as being able to operate like we do?
But is that anthropocentric for us to draw so much importance on the brain? Because we've got a big brain, but what if actually in terms of evolution, it might be something else that becomes more important?
We have our own perception of what intelligence is.
Sure. Yeah.
Intelligence is the ability to, negotiate complex tasks. And there are lots of very, very simple organisms that can do that and do it better than we can.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, one for another time, I'm sure we'll get back into that. Final question, Steve, is from Jasmine on Instagram. Do animals start to learn about other animals' tricks over time? E.g., do any of them work out that stick insects aren't actually sticks, or do they fall for it every time?
Effectively, what you're talking about there is an evolutionary arms race. It's a predator adapting its abilities to be able to catch prey, and prey doing the same to avoid being caught by a predator. And there are so many examples of this happening. I think the ones that I should focus on are the ones that we have observed happening now and changing in real time. So this is a study from the British Ecological Society, their Journal of Animal Ecology, and it is by Lisa Hamel-Einen and Johanna Mapes and Hannah Rowland. So they've come together, and this is a paper that was written on the foraging habits of blue tits and great tits, and the fact that blue tits would observe great tits foraging and they would observe blue tits foraging. And if one had a bad day, they caught a hold of, for example, a ladybird, tried to eat it, was disgusting, spat it out, the bird that had watched it would be less likely to take that same prey item themselves. So they were learning, they were observing another animal, even another animal from a different, though related species. They'd see it doing something, having a bad time, and then wouldn't do it themselves. The most interesting, I think, is the cane toad in Australia. So I'm sure we'll do a whole special on invasives at some point. Probably the most destructive invasive species of all time is the cane toad, released to Australia with the bizarre, erroneous belief that they were going to take on cane toad beetles in the sugarcane fields.
They can't
Didn't
jump,
work.
right?
They can't jump. They live way out high, but they proliferated over the entirety of Australia and had a huge negative impact on all of the indigenous wildlife because they have these parotid or parotoid glands at the back of the head that have really potent poisons, and anything that tries to eat them basically gets killed. And that has been the story right through until very, very recently, when biologists are starting to notice adaptations, in particular Australian animals, that are learning how to deal with cane toads. So, for example, snakes like the red-bellied black snake are evolving with a decreased jaw size, so they're simply not big enough to take in and swallow a cane toad. So they don't take them on, they leave them. They move on to other things. Some of the raptors, the wedge-tailed eagle, classically, have learned that they will only consume parts of the toad that are not toxic. So they may eat the heart and the liver, but not eat the toxic skin, and they will pull it off. They'll shred the skin off the cane toad. And then Australian water rats can make an incision to access the heart and the liver and avoid the toad's toxic skin and glands.
Again, underrated. The rat comes back
There
up
you go.
every time.
But all of this is happening really quickly. This is happening within decades. Everyone has been cataclysmic for very good reasons about what the cane toad was going to do to Australia and to its wildlife, and that has happened. But now these animals are starting to learn, and they're starting to learn, not as in the way that we learn, they're starting to learn through natural selection really, really quickly, and starting to evolve adaptations to enable them to cope with what could have completely destroyed all of Australia's native wildlife.
And you mentioned at the beginning about kind of going full circle about that evolutionary arms race. Obviously, these pressures are going to drive lots of these animals to up their game, and they have to, right, in order for that to be passed on through generations. All right, that's all we've got time for this week. Please send in your questions. We love getting them. So send in to questions@that'sjustwild.com and we'll answer them on the show.
Now, we are just a little spring lamb of a show, so any support's really welcome. You can follow us on your favourite podcast app, leave us a review, but only if it's a good one, or I'll find out where you live. It makes all the difference to the whole team. I won't really...
And we'll send you a hamper to make you next to another one.
Threats from Steve. And for ad-free listening, our newsletter, special deep dive episodes and members-only benefits, you can subscribe to us at that'sjustwild.com. Remember, we're on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and you can find us on @that'sjustwildpod. Thanks for listening. See you next week.
See you next week.
What happened to MySpace?
Don't get it.